Jake Morrison checked his rifle one last time and looked across the rocky ground at his team. 12 of the best human soldiers in the galaxy crouched behind broken stones and twisted metal, waiting for his signal. The fortress world of Zarian. Prime stretched out before them like a nightmare made of crystal and steel. Purple energy shields flickered around the massive walls while alien guards moved like shadows between the towers. This was it. The last chance humanity had to stop the Valerian Empire before they crushed every human colony in known space. 3 years of war had brought them to this moment, and Jake knew most of his people would not see tomorrow. Lieutenant Sam Carter moved up beside him, his dark face streaked with dirt and sweat. Sam had been Jake's friend since basic training on Earth, and they had fought through dozens of battles together. "You sure about this plan, Jake?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake nodded and pointed toward the command bunker that rose like a black pyramid from the center of the fortress. "That's where Empress Leia of Aldris runs her war. We take that down, and maybe our people back home get a chance to breathe." The plan was simple because it had to be. Human technology could not match the energy weapons and force fields that the Valerian Empire used. What humans had was something else entirely. They had the ability to adapt, to think in ways that confused their enemies, and to keep fighting when any reasonable person would surrender. Jake raised his hand and made a cutting motion. His team spread out across the battlefield like water, flowing around rocks. They moved in patterns that looked random but were actually carefully planned. The Valerian guards expected organized attacks with clear lines and obvious targets. Instead, they got chaos that somehow worked. The first phase went perfectly. Lisa Grant, their medic, used her small size to slip between the outer sensors. She planted charges on the power generators while the guards looked in other directions. When the explosion started, Jake's team was already moving toward the gaps in the shield wall. Energy beams cut through the air like angry lightning, turning rocks into glass and metal into steam. Jake rolled behind a broken vehicle and heard Sam cursing as purple fire passed inches from his head. The Valerian weapons were incredibly powerful, but they took time to recharge between shots. That small delay was all human soldiers needed to keep moving. "Lisa, status report," Jake called into his radio as he sprinted from cover to cover. "Generator 3's down, but they're rerouting power faster than we expected," came her reply. Lisa's voice was steady despite the hell erupting around them. "You've got maybe 10 minutes before full shields come back online." Jake knew 10 minutes was not enough time to reach the command bunker through conventional routes. That meant they had to do something completely insane, which was exactly what humans did best. He spotted a loading dock on the fortress's east side where supply ships normally landed. The area was lightly defended because no one would be crazy enough to attack uphill through an open killing field. "All units, new plan," Jake announced. "We're going up the middle." Sam's voice crackled through the radio with disbelief. "Up the middle? Jake, that's suicide." "That's why they won't expect it," Jake replied, already moving toward the loading dock. "Trust me." The next few minutes became a blur of running, diving, and shooting. Jake's team charged straight at the most dangerous part of the fortress, while Valerian soldiers scrambled to understand what was happening. Human tactics made no sense to aliens who fought wars like chess games with clear rules and predictable moves. Tony Baker, their demolitions expert, used his last rocket to blow a hole in the loading dock wall. The explosion sent chunks of crystalline material flying in all directions, and Jake felt something sharp cut across his cheek as he dove through the smoking gap. Inside the fortress, the fighting became even more intense. Valerian soldiers were tall and graceful, with pale blue skin and large dark eyes that could see energy patterns invisible to humans. They moved like dancers and fought with weapons that hummed with deadly power. But they had never faced enemies who treated warfare like a contact sport. Jake's team split into 3 groups, each taking a different route toward the command bunker. The idea was to divide the defenders' attention and create so much confusion that at least one group might make it to the target. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was something humans understood better than most species. The fortress corridors were works of art. with walls that seemed to be made of living crystal and floors that glowed with soft light. Under different circumstances, Jake might have admired the beauty of Valyrian architecture. Right now, he only cared about finding the fastest path to Empress Lyra Veldris. One by one, Jake's friends started to fall. Tony Baker was caught in an energy net that crushed him like an invisible fist. Maria Santos, their communications specialist, held off 6 Valyrian guards so the rest of her group could escape, and Jake heard her final transmission cut off in the middle of a word. By the time Jake reached the outer chambers of the command bunker, only 4 of his original 12 team members were still alive. Sam Carter was bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, but still carried his rifle like it weighed nothing. Lisa Grant had used most of her medical supplies on wounded teammates and looked exhausted. Pete Johnson, their sniper, had somehow managed to keep his long-range weapon intact despite all the close-quarters fighting. The command bunker's entrance was protected by a door that looked like it was made of solid diamond. Energy barriers flickered across its surface, and Jake could see Valyrian soldiers moving behind transparent walls. This was the heart of the enemy's operation, and it was defended like it should be. "Lisa, Peaches, find another way in," Jake ordered. "Sam and I will keep them busy." Jake knew this was probably the end, but he also knew his team had already accomplished something important. Every minute the Valyrian Empire spent fighting them was a minute the human colonies had to prepare their defenses. Every enemy soldier they destroyed here would not be available to attack human families somewhere else. The final assault was everything Jake had expected it to be. Energy weapons turned the air into a storm of light and heat while humans answered with bullets and explosives that seemed primitive by comparison. Sam Carter fell defending the corridor that led to the bunker's rear entrance, and Jake heard Lisa Grant's voice over the radio confirming that Pete Johnson had been hit by a sniper's beam. Jake found himself alone, standing in front of the diamond door with his rifle empty and his body covered in cuts and burns. He could hear Valyrian soldiers approaching from behind, and he knew they would not give him another chance to fight. Instead of surrendering, Jake pulled the pin from his last grenade and prepared to charge the door. If he was going to die, he would make sure Empress Lyra Veldris knew that humans would never stop fighting for their freedom. But as Jake stepped forward, something struck him from behind and the world went dark. Jake woke up in a room that seemed to be made entirely of crystal. The walls glowed with soft blue light, and the air smelled like flowers he had never encountered before. His head pounded with pain, and when he tried to move, he discovered that invisible bonds held his arms and legs in place. He was lying on something that felt like a bed, but looked like it was carved from a single piece of transparent stone. The last thing Jake remembered was pulling the pin from his grenade and charging toward the diamond door of the command bunker. He should be dead right now, blown to pieces along with whatever Valyrian soldiers had been nearby. Instead, he was very much alive, and apparently a prisoner of war. Jake tested the bonds that held him and found they were stronger than steel cables, even though he could not see them at all. The Valyrian Empire had technology that made their invisible restraints completely unbreakable by human strength. He stopped struggling and tried to figure out where he was, and what his captors planned to do with him. The crystal room was beautiful in a way that made Jake uncomfortable. Everything was too perfect, too clean, too alien for someone who had spent most of his life in military bases and battlefields. There were no sharp corners anywhere, and the light seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than from any visible source. It was like being inside a jewelry box designed by someone who had never seen anything ugly. After what felt like several hours, a section of the wall simply melted away, and 3 figures entered the room. 2 of them were clearly Valyrian soldiers, tall and graceful with pale blue skin and dark eyes that seemed to see everything at once. They wore armor that looked like it was made of flowing water, and they carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. The 3rd figure made Jake forget about the guards completely. She was smaller than the soldiers, but carried herself like someone who expected the entire universe to obey her commands. Her skin was the same pale blue as the others, but her eyes were different, almost silver in color. She wore robes that seemed to be cut from starlight itself, and when she moved, the air around her shimmered like heat waves. Jake knew immediately who she was, even though he had only seen her in intelligence photos before. This was Empress Lyra. Valdris, the ruler of the Valyrian Empire and the person responsible for 3 years of war that had killed millions of humans. She was younger than the propaganda had suggested, maybe in her 30s by human standards, but she had the kind of presence that made the room feel smaller just by being in it. The Empress studied Jake for a long moment without speaking. Her silver eyes seemed to be looking right through him, reading thoughts he did not even know he was thinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and musical, but there was something tired about it that Jake had not expected. "Captain Jake?" "Morrison," she said, and Jake was surprised that she knew his name and rank. "You fought very well today. Your tactical decisions were most interesting." Jake decided that silence was probably his best option. He was a prisoner of war, and anything he said could be used to hurt his fellow humans. The Empress seemed to understand his reluctance to talk because she smiled slightly and the expression made her look even younger. "You are wondering why you are still alive?" the Empress continued. "Your plan was to destroy this facility and kill me in the process. Instead, you are here, unharmed except for some minor injuries that our medical systems have already healed." Jake looked down at his body and realized she was right. The cuts and burns he had received during the battle were completely gone, and even the old scars from previous fights had faded to almost nothing. Valyrian medical technology was apparently as advanced as their weapons. "I kept you alive because I have something to show you," the Empress said. "Something that will change how you think about this war." The crystal walls around them suddenly became transparent, revealing that they were not in a room at all, but in some kind of observation chamber. Beyond the walls stretched a view of space that took Jake's breath away. Stars filled the darkness, like scattered diamonds, and nearby, a planet hung in the void like a blue and green jewel, but something was wrong with the planet. Large sections of its surface were completely black, as if someone had taken a giant eraser and removed entire continents. The oceans looked gray instead of blue, and there were no lights visible on the night side where cities should have been. Glowing, "This is Corinthia 7, the Empress said quietly. It was home to 4 billion Valyrian citizens until 6 months ago. Now it is home to nothing at all." Jake stared at the dead world and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the crystal chamber. "What happened to it?" "The Devourers," the Empress replied, and her voice carried a weight of grief that Jake had never heard from an enemy before. "They consume everything, life, energy, matter itself. They leave nothing behind except empty space where entire civilizations used to exist." The view changed, showing Jake other worlds in various stages of destruction. Some looked like Corinthia 7, completely lifeless and gray. Others were partially consumed, with spreading areas of nothingness that seemed to eat reality itself. A few showed desperate evacuation efforts, with ships fleeing from something that Jake could not quite see, but that made his skin crawl just by looking at it. "The Valyrian Empire has been fighting the Devourers for 70 years, the Empress explained. "We have lost 138 worlds to them. Billions of my people are dead or simply gone, erased from existence as if they never lived at all." Jake found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why are you telling me this?" The Empress turned away from the view of destroyed worlds and looked directly at him. "Because the Valyrian Empire is losing this war. Our weapons are useless against them. Our tactics fail because the Devourers adapt to anything we try within hours. Our entire civilization is dying, and we have perhaps 5 years before they reach our core worlds. That still doesn't explain why I'm alive." Jake said, "You are alive because humans fight differently than we do," the Empress replied. "Today, you and your team did something that no Valyrian military force has accomplished in decades. You surprised us. You used tactics that made no logical sense, and because of that, you nearly succeeded in an impossible mission." Jake thought about his team, about Sam Carter and Lisa Grant and all the others who had died trying to complete their mission. "My people are dead because of you. Your people are dead because of war," the Empress corrected him. But they died fighting in ways that the Devourers have never encountered. They used weapons and strategies that the enemy cannot predict or counter because they are based on chaos rather than order. The crystal chamber fell silent except for the barely audible hum of Valyrian technology. Jake stared at the dead worlds visible through the transparent walls and tried to process what he was being told. The empire that had been humanity's greatest enemy was itself being destroyed by something even worse. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked finally. Empress Lyra Valdris moved closer to where Jake lay bound by invisible restraints. "I want you to help me save both our peoples," she said. "I want you to teach my soldiers how to fight like humans. I want you to show us how to turn chaos into victory." Jake looked into her silver eyes and saw something he had never expected to find in his greatest enemy. He saw desperation and hope, and the terrible weight of responsibility for billions of lives that hung in the balance. "And if I refuse? Then the Devourers will consume your worlds after they finish with mine," the Empress said simply, "and both our species will cease to exist." Jake spent 3 days in the crystal chamber thinking about everything the Empress had told him. The invisible restraints had been removed, but the walls remained transparent, showing him the endless view of dead worlds that the Devourers had consumed. Every time he looked at those gray, lifeless planets, he thought about Earth and the human colonies that might suffer the same fate. On the 4th day, Empress Lyra returned with a small device that projected 3-dimensional images into the air between them. She showed Jake recordings from Valyrian battles against the Devourers, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The enemy was unlike anything humanity had ever faced. The Devourers did not look like traditional aliens with recognizable shapes and features. Instead, they appeared as shifting masses of darkness that seemed to eat light itself. When they moved across a battlefield, reality seemed to bend and twist around them. Valyrian energy weapons passed right through them without causing any damage, and their psychic abilities were turned back against them like reflected lightning. "Watch how they adapt," the Empress said as the recording showed a Valyrian fleet trying to destroy a Devourer ship. The first few energy blasts seemed to have some effect, causing the dark mass to ripple and contract. But within minutes, the same weapons became completely useless, their beams absorbed into the enemy's shifting form. Jake studied the tactical displays and began to understand why the Valyrian Empire was losing so badly. Their entire military philosophy was based on order, precision, and overwhelming technological superiority. They fought wars like engineers solving complex equations, with every move calculated and every outcome predicted, against an enemy that could adapt to any strategy within hours. Such an approach was suicide. "Your people fight with honor and discipline," Jake said carefully. "But honor means nothing to something that wants to erase you from existence." The Empress nodded sadly. "This is what I have tried to tell my generals for years. But they cannot accept that their methods are useless. They would rather die with dignity than live by abandoning their traditions." Jake looked at the recordings again and felt an idea beginning to form in his mind. Humans had never been the strongest or the smartest species in the galaxy, but they had survived on Earth by being the most adaptable. They had learned to fight dirty when necessary, to use whatever weapons were available, and to keep changing their tactics until something worked. "I'll help you," Jake said finally. "But I have conditions." The Empress raised an eyebrow, which was apparently a universal expression of surprise. "You are hardly in a position to make demands, Captain Morrison. If you want me to train your soldiers to fight like humans, then you need to let me do it my way," Jake continued. "No interference from your generals, no complaints about methods that seem dishonorable, and no backing down when things get difficult." For a long moment, the Empress studied Jake's face as if she were trying to read his thoughts. Then she smiled, and the expression transformed her entire appearance from imperial ruler to something almost human. "Very well. I accept your conditions." The next day, Jake found himself in a training facility that looked like a cross between a gymnasium and a crystal cathedral. 20 Valyrian soldiers stood in perfect formation, their pale blue skin gleaming under the artificial lights. They were all tall and graceful, with the kind of natural elegance that made human movements look clumsy by comparison. Among them was Colonel Alex Torres, a Valyrian officer who had spent years studying human languages and culture. His knowledge of English was nearly perfect, and he served as translator when Jake's instructions became too complex for the others to understand. There was also Captain Maya Brooks, who was half human and half Valyrian, the result of a rare union between the two species. Her mixed heritage made her look almost human except for her pale blue eyes and slightly pointed ears. Jake's first lesson was simple. He made the Valyrian soldiers throw away their energy weapons. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Several of the soldiers looked shocked, as if Jake had asked them to cut off their own limbs. Colonel Torres stepped forward with a confused expression on his face. "Captain Morrison, these weapons have served the Valyrian military for thousands of years," Torres said. "They are works of art as well as instruments of war." "And they're completely useless against the Devourers," Jake replied bluntly. "I watched your recordings. Every energy weapon you have is absorbed by the enemy within minutes. If you want to kill something that eats energy, you need to use something else." Jake had requested a supply of human-style kinetic weapons, and the Empress had somehow managed to provide them. Rifles that fired metal bullets, pistols that used chemical explosives, and even some grenades that relied on simple fragmentation, rather than exotic energy fields. To Valyrian eyes, these weapons looked primitive and brutal. "These devices are crude," Captain Brooks observed, holding a human assault rifle like it might explode in her hands. "How can something so simple be more effective than our advanced technology?" "Because simple is harder to adapt to," Jake explained. "A bullet is just a piece of metal flying really fast. There's no energy signature to absorb, no complex systems to turn against you. It's basic physics, and physics doesn't change just because your enemy is smart." The training that followed was unlike anything the Valyrian soldiers had ever experienced. Jake taught them to fight without formation, to use cover instead of energy shields, and to think like individuals rather than parts of a larger machine. He showed them how to move unpredictably, how to use the environment as a weapon, and how to keep fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. The most difficult lesson was teaching them to embrace chaos. Valyrian culture valued order and beauty above almost everything else, and the idea of deliberately creating confusion went against every instinct they had. But Jake knew that chaos was humanity's greatest advantage in warfare. After 2 weeks of intensive training, the Empress herself joined the sessions. Her advisors were horrified at the idea of their ruler learning to fight with primitive weapons, but she insisted on participating like any other soldier. Jake found himself teaching the most powerful person in the Valyrian Empire how to hold a rifle properly and how to dive for cover when someone started shooting. The Empress was a quick learner, but she struggled with the same issues as her soldiers. She wanted everything to be precise and elegant, while Jake was trying to teach her that sometimes the best solution was messy and brutal. During one particularly frustrating session, she threw down her rifle in disgust. "This is impossible," she said. "How can intelligent beings fight in such a disorganized manner?" "Because disorganized doesn't mean ineffective," Jake replied. "Watch." He set up a training scenario where the Empress and her soldiers had to defend the position against simulated attackers. When they tried to use traditional Valyrian tactics, they were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. But when they followed Jake's instructions to spread out, use guerrilla techniques, and coordinate through instinct rather than rigid command structures, they managed to hold their ground. The breakthrough came during their 3rd week of training. Intelligence reports indicated that a small Devourer scout force had been detected approaching a remote Valyrian outpost. Instead of sending a traditional military response, the Empress decided to test Jake's training methods in actual combat. The force that left for the outpost looked nothing like a proper Valyrian military unit. 20 soldiers carrying primitive kinetic weapons, moving in loose formations that seemed almost random to outside observers. Jake went with them as an advisor, while the Empress monitored the battle from the command center. The Devourers attacked. just as the recordings had shown, appearing as shifting masses of darkness that seemed to drain light from the surrounding area. The Valyrian defenders tried their usual energy weapons first, and just as expected, the beams were absorbed without effect. Then Jake gave the signal to switch to human tactics. What followed was unlike any battle the Valyrian Empire had ever fought. Soldiers moved like shadows, using hit-and-run tactics that confused the enemy's ability to adapt. Kinetic weapons proved surprisingly effective against creatures that could absorb energy but had difficulty dealing with simple physical impact. Most importantly, the chaotic nature of human combat prevented the Devourers from predicting and countering the defenders' next moves. When the battle ended 6 hours later, the outpost was still standing and the Devourer scout force had been completely destroyed. For the first time in decades, the Valyrian Empire had achieved a clear victory against their greatest enemy. The Empress was waiting when Jake returned to the training facility. Her silver eyes were bright with something that looked like hope, and when she spoke, her voice carried a new note of respect. "It worked," she said simply. "Your methods actually worked." Jake nodded, but he also felt the weight of what this victory meant. They had proven that humans and Valyrians could fight together successfully, but they had also committed both species to a war that would determine the fate of entire civilizations. "This is just the beginning," Jake warned. "The Devourers will adapt to what we did today. We need to stay ahead of them, keep changing our tactics, and be ready for anything." The Empress moved closer to Jake, and for the victory at the outpost changed everything between Jake and the Empress. What had started as a desperate alliance between enemies began to transform into something deeper and more complex. Over the following months they worked together to expand the training program and prepare for larger battles against the Devourers. Jake found himself spending more and more time in the Empress's private chambers, discussing strategy and sharing stories about their respective peoples. The crystal walls that had once seemed like a beautiful prison now felt like a sanctuary, where two very different beings could speak honestly without the weight of their official roles. "Tell me about Earth," the Empress said one evening as they reviewed tactical reports. She had abandoned her formal robes for simpler clothing that made her look younger and more approachable. "What is it like to grow up on a world where everyone fights for survival?" Jake thought about his childhood in the military academies, where every lesson had been about preparing for war against alien enemies. He had never known a time when humanity was not threatened by something, and that constant danger had shaped every aspect of human culture. "We never had a choice about being warriors," Jake said. "Earth is a hard world that tried to kill us long before we ever met aliens. Storms, earthquakes, diseases, predators. Everything on our planet taught us that life is something you have to fight for every single day." The Empress listened with fascination as Jake described human history with its endless cycles of conflict and survival. She began to understand why humans fought so differently from Valyrians, who had enjoyed centuries of peace and prosperity before the Devourers arrived. Humans had been forged in violence, while Valyrians had been shaped by beauty and order. "I envy you sometimes," the Empress admitted. "Your people know who they are because they have always had clear enemies to fight against. My people have forgotten how to struggle because we made everything too easy for too long." As their personal relationship deepened, Jake began to see past the imperial facade that the Empress wore in public. Her real name was Lyra, and she had never wanted to rule an empire. The crown had been forced upon her when her father, the previous emperor, had been killed by a Devourer infiltrator that had somehow reached the capital world. "I was supposed to be a scholar," Lyra told Jake during one of their late-night conversations. "I wanted to study ancient history and write books about civilizations that existed before spaceflight. Instead, I inherited a war that I do not know how to win." Jake understood the weight of responsibility that Lyra carried because he had felt something similar when his own soldiers looked to him for leadership during impossible missions. But where Jake commanded dozens of people, Lyra was responsible for the lives of billions across hundreds of worlds. "You're doing better than you think," Jake said. "A year ago, your empire was losing every battle against the Devourers. Now we have a chance." Their growing partnership was tested during a major Devourer assault on the industrial world of Nexus Prime. Intelligence reports indicated that this was not a scouting mission but a full-scale invasion designed to capture the shipyards that produced most of the Valyrian fleet. If Nexus Prime fell, the Empire would lose its ability to build new vessels, making their eventual defeat inevitable. Jake found himself commanding a mixed force of human and Valyrian soldiers, including Colonel Alex Torres, who had become his most trusted lieutenant. Torres had adapted to human fighting methods better than anyone else, combining Valyrian precision with human unpredictability to create a deadly new style of warfare. The battle for Nexus Prime lasted 6 days and became the largest engagement between Allied forces and the Devourers since the war began. Jake's troops used every tactic he had taught them, from guerrilla ambush to coordinated artillery strikes using primitive explosive shells that the enemy could not absorb, but the Devourers were learning too. They began to adapt to human tactics much faster than before, forcing Jake to constantly change his strategies to stay ahead of their evolution. What worked in the morning might be completely useless by afternoon, requiring a level of tactical flexibility that pushed both human and Valyrian soldiers to their limits. The turning point came on the 4th day when Colonel Torres led a desperate assault on a Devourer command node that had been identified in the industrial sector. The mission required his team to fight through several miles of enemy-held territory with no hope of reinforcement or retreat. Jake wanted to go with them, but Torres insisted on leading the mission himself. "You have taught us to think like humans," Torres said before departing. "Now, let us prove that we have learned your lessons well." The assault succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Torres and half his team died, destroying the command node, their sacrifice buying enough time for Jake to organize a final counterattack that drove the Devourers away from Nexus Prime. When Jake found Torres's body among the wreckage, he felt a grief that surprised him with its intensity. Torres had become more than just a fellow soldier during their months of training together. He had been a bridge between two species, proof that humans and Valyrians could truly understand each other despite their differences. His death felt like losing a brother, and Jake spent several hours sitting beside the body, honoring a friend who had died fighting for both their peoples. The Empress arrived at the battlefield as cleanup operations were beginning. She found Jake in the ruins of the industrial sector, still covered in dust and blood from the final assault. When she saw Torres's body, her normally composed expression cracked, and Jake saw tears in her silver eyes. "He was a good soldier," she said quietly. "He deserved better than to die in this horrible war." "He died protecting billions of people," Jake replied. "In human culture, that makes him a hero." The Empress looked at Jake with an expression he had never seen before. "Is that how you see all of this? Are we heroes fighting for something greater than ourselves?" Jake thought about his team from the original assault on Zarian Prime, about Sam Carter and Lisa Grant and all the others who had died believing they were saving humanity from destruction. Now he was fighting alongside former enemies to save both their species from something even worse. "I think we're just people trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation," Jake said. "Sometimes that's all heroes really are." The victory at Nexus Prime proved that the alliance between humans and Valyrians could work on a massive scale, but it also revealed the enormous cost of their war against the Devourers. Casualty reports showed that they had lost nearly 30% of their forces, including some of their best officers and most experienced soldiers. More importantly, intelligence analysis suggested that the attack on Nexus Prime had been a test. The Devourers were probing the strength of the new alliance, learning about human tactics while revealing as little as possible about their own capabilities. The real war was still to come. As Jake and the Empress returned to the capital world, they both understood that their partnership had evolved beyond a simple military alliance. They had become something that neither of their species had words for, two leaders bound together by shared responsibility and growing affection. "The Council of Advisors wants me to send you back to human space," the Empress told Jake as their transport ship approached the capital. "They believe you have taught us everything we need to know about fighting the Devourers." Jake felt his heart skip a beat at the thought of leaving Lyra to face the coming battles alone. "What do you want?" The Empress was quiet for a long time. Before answering, "I want you to stay," she said finally. "But I also know that your people need to join this war if any of us are going to survive. Earth's military must be convinced to fight alongside us before the Devourers reach human space." Jake realized that he was facing the most difficult choice of his life. He could stay with Lyra and continue building the alliance between their species, or he could return to Earth and try to convince humanity's leaders that their former enemies had become their only hope for survival. Either choice would mean abandoning people he cared about at the moment when they needed him most. But as he looked at Lyra's face and saw the weight of impossible decisions reflected in her silver eyes, Jake began to understand that some choices were too important to be made for personal reasons alone. The war against the Devourers was bigger than any one person, bigger than the feelings between a human soldier and an alien empress. It was about the survival of entire civilizations, and that responsibility had to come before everything else, even love. Jake's return to Earth felt like stepping into a dream from another lifetime. The blue skies and white clouds seemed impossibly bright after months aboard Valyrian ships with their crystal walls and artificial lighting. When his transport landed at the military base outside New Geneva, he was greeted by General Katie Phillips and Admiral Ben Rogers, two of humanity's most senior commanders. The debriefing took 3 days and covered every detail of Jake's capture, his alliance with the Empress, and the threat posed by the Devourers. The human leadership listened with growing alarm as Jake described worlds consumed by darkness and civilizations erased from existence as if they had never lived at all. "You're asking us to ally with the same empire that has been trying to exterminate humanity for 3 years, General Phillips said during one particularly tense session. "How do we know this isn't some elaborate trick to get us to lower our defenses?" Jake had expected this reaction, but it still frustrated him to see his own people refusing to understand the scope of the threat they faced. "Because the Valyrians are losing," he said bluntly. "They've lost over 100 worlds to the Devourers. If they wanted to destroy humanity, they would not need to invent a fake enemy to do it." Admiral Rogers was more receptive to Jake's arguments, especially when the intelligence data he had brought from Valyrian space was analyzed by Earth's best scientists. The recordings of Devourer attacks were unlike anything humanity had encountered before, showing an enemy that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. "These things absorb energy weapons like sponges," Rogers observed while reviewing battle footage. "Our entire fleet is armed with plasma cannons and particle beams. If these recordings are accurate, our ships would be completely helpless against them." Jake spent weeks traveling between military bases and government facilities, trying to convince Earth's leaders that an alliance with the Valyrian Empire was humanity's only chance for survival. The process was slow and painful, filled with political arguments and bureaucratic delays that made Jake want to scream with frustration. Meanwhile, reports from frontier colonies began to confirm Jake's warnings about the Devourer threat. 3. Outer settlements had gone completely silent, their populations vanishing without any distress signals or signs of struggle. Scout ships sent to investigate found empty buildings and dead technology, exactly like the Valyrian worlds Jake had seen in the Empress's recordings. The breakthrough came when a Devourer scout force attacked the mining colony on Kepler Station. The battle was recorded by automated defense systems before they too went silent, providing Earth's military with undeniable proof that Jake's warnings were real. The footage showed human soldiers and civilian miners simply disappearing when the dark masses touched them, erased from existence as if they had never been born. "We need to mobilize the entire fleet," General Phillips announced during an emergency council meeting. "If these things are spreading through human space, we have to stop them before they reach Earth." Jake knew that a conventional military response would be suicide, just as it had been for the Valyrians. "You need to let me return with a mixed force," he argued. "Human and Valyrian soldiers working together, using the tactics we developed. It's the only thing that has worked against the Devourers." The council approved his request, but the force they gave him was smaller than Jake had hoped. 50 human Marines, volunteers who were willing to work with former enemies for the sake of survival. It was not much, but it was a start toward the kind of cooperation that would be needed to win the war. As Jake prepared to leave Earth for what might be the last time, he received a personal message from Empress Lyra that had been transmitted through secret Valyrian communication channels. The message was brief but carried terrible news about the situation in Valyrian space, that the Empress's advisors had finally acted on their threats to remove her from power. A group of military commanders led by General Cain Vortis had staged a coup, claiming that the alliance with humans was a betrayal of Valyrian honor and tradition. Lyra had been placed under house arrest while the conspirators prepared to resume the war against humanity. Jake felt his blood turn to ice as he read the message. Without the Empress's protection, the human-Valyrian alliance would collapse, and both species would be destroyed separately by the Devourers. But more than that, Jake realized that Lyra herself was in mortal danger from her own people. The message included coordinates for a secret rendezvous point near the border between human and Valyrian space. Lyra had somehow escaped from her captors and was waiting for Jake with a small group of loyal followers. She was asking him to meet her there, but she was not asking him to abandon Earth or humanity for her sake. Instead, she was offering to come to human space and continue their alliance from Earth, even if it meant never seeing her homeworld again. She was willing to give up everything she had ever known for the sake of their partnership and the war against the Devours. Jake stood in his quarters aboard the transport ship that would take him back to Valyrian space, holding the message and trying to decide what to do. He could follow his original orders and return to the capital world with his human Marines, hoping to somehow restore Lyra to power and continue their alliance through official channels, or he could change course and meet Lyra at the rendezvous point, helping her escape to human space where they could continue their work together without the interference of Valyrian politics. It would mean abandoning the Empress's loyal supporters who were still fighting against the coup, but it would also ensure that their alliance survived. Jake thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. He remembered his team, dying during the assault on Zarian Prime, sacrificing their lives for what they believed was humanity's survival. He thought about Colonel Torres and the other Valyrian soldiers who had died learning to fight like humans, proving that former enemies could become brothers in arms. Most of all, he thought about Lyra, who had trusted him with the survival of her entire species and had somehow become the most important person in his universe. She had shown him that the war between humans and Valyrians was meaningless compared to the threat they faced together, and she had been willing to risk everything. To save both their peoples, Jake made his decision and ordered the ship's pilot to change course toward the rendezvous coordinates. Whatever happened next, he would not abandon the woman who had become his partner in every sense that mattered. The Empress had asked him to stay once before, and he had chosen duty over personal feelings. This time he was choosing both. When Jake's ship arrived at the rendezvous point, he found Lyra waiting aboard a small Valyrian vessel with only a handful of followers. She was no longer wearing her imperial robes or the crown that had marked her as the ruler of an empire. Instead, she looked like what she had always been underneath the ceremony and protocol, a young woman trying to save her people from destruction. "You came," she said when Jake boarded her ship, and he could hear the relief and joy in her voice. "I told you once that we would face whatever comes together," Jake replied. "I meant it." As their ships turned toward human space, Jake knew that they were both choosing love over safety, partnership over politics, and hope over despair. The war against the Devourers was far from over, but for the first time since it began, Jake felt like they had a real chance to win. Behind them, the Valyrian Empire continued to tear itself apart with civil war while the Devourers consumed world after world. Ahead of them lay Earth and the uncertain prospect of convincing humanity to trust former enemies. But between them was something that neither species had expected to find in the middle of a war. For survival, proof that understanding and affection could exist even between the most unlikely allies. The Empress, who had once been Jake's greatest enemy was now the person he could not imagine living without. And the soldier who had been meant to die fighting her army had become the one person she trusted to help save both their worlds.